tuned. We are joined today by Dr. John Mearsheimer. He is a distinguished service professor of political science at the University of Chicago and also one of the most well-known and well-respected political scientists in the world. He's also known for developing the theory of offensive realism, which is now taught all over the world. He's also author of a number of books, all of whom have had a deep impact on global politics. We are very honored to have you with us today, Dr. Mearsheimer.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, as we look at the unfolding situation in the war on Iran, Dr. Mearsheimer, you must have also been following events. Of course, there are two parallel tracks that we are witnessing. One is the actual war itself, and the other is the diplomatic channel which is trying to be established, and Pakistan, of course, is taking the lead. We had a very important meeting of foreign ministers here recently in Pakistan. So I want to start with asking you about the prospects of a diplomatic solution at this stage and the key role that Pakistan is playing at this very important time.
Let's start by just talking about where the war is at. It's very important to understand that Iran is winning the war and that Iran has a vested interest in not ending the war until it gets what it demands. The United States, however, cannot make the necessary concessions to Iran at this point in time. So the war will go on. Iran, again, has a vested interest in continuing the war because as we move up the escalation ladder, Iran has an advantage over the United States. But what's happening here is that as a result of this conflict, there is a serious possibility that enormous damage is going to be done to the international economy. And for that reason, President Trump is desperate to find a solution to end the war. You want to remember, it's President Trump who's coming to Pakistan and asking to end the war. That's because he understands the dangers ahead. It's not the Iranians who want to end the war. At this point in time, the Iranians will not end the war until they get a decent settlement. And I don't see that happening right away.
And if that is the case, Dr. Mearsheimer, and as you said that the President Trump is more interested in finding a diplomatic solution, that is why he's often referring to the efforts that Pakistan is undertaking. Of course, Turkey is involved, Egypt is involved, now Saudi Arabia also, their foreign minister was also here in Islamabad. So all these middle powers are now trying to find an off-ramp. Do you think that this effort that is underway, even though at this point, as you're saying, it looks very difficult, but could it become a platform if at some point both parties decide that they need some exit? Could this initiative provide them the exit that they're looking for?
Look, there's no question that at some point there's going to be a negotiated settlement, or at least there is likely to be a negotiated settlement. But the only question is when we will reach that point. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, it will happen when the United States decides it absolutely has to shut this war down. If the United States can continue the war and not a great price, then the war will continue. Because again, Iran has no incentive to stop the war now. Iran is winning the war and it's gaining more and more leverage over the West. Furthermore, Iran doesn't trust any of the countries you named. Iran doesn't trust anyone except maybe the Russians and the Chinese. But they don't trust the Saudis, who are their adversaries at this point in time. They don't trust the Pakistanis in any meaningful way. And Iran should not trust anyone. Iran is in a self-help situation. Iran should take care of itself. It should get the best deal possible. And trust should matter little here. And what the Iranians want to do is put the United States in a position where it has no choice, where the Trump administration has no choice but to agree in large part to the terms that Iran is demanding.
But if those terms are accepted by President Trump, Dr. Mearsheimer, that would pretty much mean the end of his political career, because he went in to defeat Iran, to have a regime change done to ensure that it does not remain a threat to Israel, as the logic goes. But if it turns out that he's the one who ends up giving concessions, is that realistic at this stage? Can you actually see the American president going down this path?
No, not at this stage. I think you're absolutely correct. That's why you're not going to get a negotiated settlement now. But the key point that you want to keep in mind, and the viewers want to keep in mind, is that President Trump is in a lose-lose situation. If he continues the war, he's not going to win it. He's going to lose. And we run the great risk that the international economy will fall off a cliff. We will end up in a worldwide depression. This is what might happen. So if that happens, he loses. Your point is, if he tries to avoid that by making major concessions to the Iranians, he will lose. And you're absolutely right. And I'm absolutely right when I say he will lose even bigger if the international economy goes off a cliff. But again, what this points out is that President Trump made a huge blunder. Let's call it a colossal blunder by entering this war against Iran. He thought he was going to win a quick and decisive victory. And once he did not win that quick and decisive victory, he was in deep trouble.
And if we look at the scale of that trouble, as you just mentioned, and we also then look at the options that he has, and none of them are good, as you said. And you've also said in your many appearances in front of the international media that a worse option is him doubling down. And if he were to do that, if he were to double down, that would in essence translate into some kind of a ground offensive. You've also said very rightly, Dr. Mearsheimer, that you can't have an effective ground offensive with 15 or 20 or 30 or 40,000 troops. So what are we looking at?
The point is that President Trump has no option for winning the war. In other words, if you go up the escalation ladder and you introduce American ground forces, you invade Iranian territory, you lose. Nobody can tell a story about how using American ground power improves our situation. In fact, it makes it worse. So the point is, going up the escalation ladder doesn't result in an American victory or doesn't improve our situation. Furthermore, the other option is you find an exit ramp, some way to end the war. Instead of escalating, you exit. But there's no exit option for the simple reason that if you exit, the Iranians will continue to fight. And the Iranians will continue to control the Strait of Hormuz. The key point here is that the Iranians hold almost all the cards. So there's no exit option, and you can't win by going up the escalation ladder. The only thing Trump can do at some point in time is concede defeat to the Iranians.
That sounds almost impossible.
Again, I think you're right that politically that is impossible at this point in time. But the question you have to ask yourself is, what will Trump do if we are in a situation where it looks like the international economy is going to go off a cliff, that there is going to be a large scale or a global economic disaster? You want to understand that what's happening here in terms of oil and gas and fertilizer coming through the Strait of Hormuz, and now maybe even coming out of the Red Sea, because as you know, the Houthis are now talking about shutting off the flow of oil and fertilizer out of the Red Sea. This will be disastrous for the international economy. It will be disastrous for President Trump. So he has two bad alternatives here. One is he can quit the war, make major concessions to the Iranians, and do enormous damage to his political career, as you said, or he can continue and we end up in a situation where we have a worldwide depression or a worldwide recession, and still he does enormous damage to his reputation.
And in both cases, in both options that you are referring to, do you think you can say at this point today that whichever option he chooses, Iran has already won the war?
I think Iran has won the war. The war is not over with yet, and we don't know exactly what it'll look like. But there's no way that the United States can open up the Strait of Hormuz and allow for the flow of oil and fertilizer and gas out of the Persian Gulf. We just can't do that. And if you look at what the Iranians are doing in terms of targeting and hitting American military installations in the region and hitting the Gulf Arab states and hitting Israel, it looks like the Iranians have the capability to inflict major damage on all those targets. I would note that the United States has 13 major military installations in the Middle East, and that the Iranians have damaged or destroyed 13, all 13 of those installations. And if you look at what they've been doing in the Gulf states, they've been wreaking havoc there. And now Israel is basically run out of interceptors. So according to Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, 8 out of every 10 Iranian ballistic missiles is getting through and hitting Israel. So you can see very clearly that Iran is in an excellent position.
And when it comes to trying to figure out how Iran has the upper hand, I would also like to refer to the situation of Israel, because as you just mentioned that Israel is being battered, Iranian missiles are going through their defenses, they've got a very strict censorship, but more information is coming out now, and it is clear that the damage to Israel is far more than is being reported in the international media. Dr. Mearsheimer, you wrote a seminal book called The Israel Lobby and the US Foreign Policy in 2006. And you've been speaking about the role of the Israeli lobby in the US. Based on what is happening now, whenever the war ends, at some point, you've said that there is no way that the US can come out looking as the victor. What happens to Israel? Will it remain a major threat to the region? Will it still try to become the regional hegemon? Or would it also end up diminished as a result of this conflict?
Well, I think there's no question that Israel will remain a major power, a dangerous state, a rogue state in the Middle East moving forward, in large part because the United States will continue to support Israel and continue to support Israel's foolish policies. But having said all that, Israel is in real trouble today. First of all, it's not only the United States that's going to lose this war against Iran, Israel's going to lose the war as well. Furthermore, I think there's a very good chance that when the war is over with, that Iran will acquire nuclear weapons. Given what's happened since February 28th, the Iranians would be foolish, in my opinion, not to acquire a nuclear deterrent. And that's the nightmare scenario for Israel. In addition to that, it's very important to understand that the Israelis are now waging a war in Lebanon. And they thought that Hezbollah was defeated last year, and Hezbollah would not be a threat, and therefore they could go to war against Hezbollah. And indeed, the Israelis thought they could conquer southern Lebanon up to the Litani. But what's happening is that the Israelis have discovered that Hezbollah has rebuilt its arsenal of rockets and missiles, and Hezbollah is firing rockets and missiles into northern Israel. And furthermore, the Israeli ground forces in southern Lebanon are having a very difficult time fighting against Hezbollah forces on the ground. In fact, Hezbollah is using sophisticated drones with fiber optics to destroy large numbers of Israeli tanks. And the Israelis are not winning the war in southern Lebanon. So if you think about where Israel is today compared to where it was before February 28th, it's in much worse shape.
Would that also include the relationship with the United States? Already, Dr. Mearsheimer, we are seeing a lot of criticism of Israel in America, something that was unheard of some time back, and especially from the right-wing circles. So this relationship, which is built on the effectiveness of the Israeli lobby, which you have also argued very well in your book. Do you think that this relationship will come under strain, and that would in some ways change the way that the United States looks at Israel and treats Israel?
I think there is no question that you are correct that this war is going to do damage to the U.S.-Israeli relationship. There's no question, because it is widely understood in the United States that Israel and the lobby, in other words, the Zionists in the United States, who push the United States to support Israel no matter what, that those two groups have caused the United States to enter this war. Absent the lobby and absent pressure from Israel, the United States would not be involved in this losing war against Iran. So it's important to emphasize that this is widely understood, and this will damage the lobby's position inside the United States for sure. But the question is, how much damage will it do? And let me just say a few words about this. When you think about the lobby's influence in the United States, you have to think about its influence on the popular discourse. In other words, how we talk about Israel, what is said in newspapers, and so forth and so on. And then you have to think about what the effects of the lobby are at the policy level, inside the White House, inside Congress. There is no question that even before February 28th, but certainly after February 28th, the discourse about Israel has changed drastically. And people are much more critical of Israel and of the lobby in ways that was not the case when Steve Walt and I wrote our book back in 2007. So the discourse about Israel has changed drastically. However, the policy has not changed yet. And the question that you have to ask yourself moving forward is how much the policy will change. In other words, will the lobby remain powerful enough that it can control, in large part, U.S. policy toward the Middle East in ways that it is done in the past? Or is this war in Iran going to do so much damage to the lobby's influence in the United States that even at the policy level, as well as the level of discourse, enormous damage will be done? And we don't know what the answer is to that question at this point in time.
We have to take a short break here. Dr. Mearsheimer is with us. When we come back, much more to discuss with him. Do stay with us. Dr. Mearsheimer, I want to talk a little bit about where we are going from here. You've mentioned that President Trump has two options. Both of them are pretty bad. Whichever one that he chooses, It's fairly obvious that Iran is coming out on top when the conflict ends, and Israel will also stand diminished. Once the war ends, regardless of which option is taken, what will the post-conflict situation look like? Specifically, what happens to the Gulf region? What happens to the larger Middle East and its political dynamics? What happens to Iran's in the region? And finally, what are the chances that middle power Muslim nations like Pakistan and Turkey and Egypt begin to play a more important and a larger role in the affairs of this region?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen as a result of this war once it's settled, because there's so many open questions here. For example, as I was saying before, Iran had nuclear weapons. Let's assume that Iran moves down the nuclear road. It moves to acquire a nuclear deterrent. How will that affect Turkey? How will that affect Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and so forth and so on? My guess is that it will lead to larger proliferation. And you have to ask yourself whether you think that is good or bad. Then you have to think about the question of the Gulf states and what they're going to do when this war ends. First of all, they're surely going to end up with terrible relations toward Iran. Iran and the Gulf states are not likely to have friendly relations when this war ends. And at the same time, are the Gulf states going to depend on the United States for their security in the future? I've actually been watching Saudi foreign policy for quite a while now, and the Saudis have been trying to distance themselves from the United States even before February 28th. Now that this war has happened and the United States has dragged the Gulf states into this war, the Gulf states are being pounded by Iran. Relations with Iran have deteriorated. Are they going to want to rely on the United States in the future? Is the United States going to be able to wield the kind of influence in the Middle East in the future that it has wielded in the past? I don't think that's true. And then you throw in on top of that the Chinese and the Russians. As you well know, the Chinese have become increasingly interested in projecting power into the greater Middle East. And I think that means that the Chinese and the Americans and even the Russians will all be involved in this region more than ever. So I find it hard to see a simple answer to what happens after the shooting stops and the war is finally settled. And by the way, the final point I would make to you is what happens to the Strait of Hormuz? Does Iran end up controlling the Strait of Hormuz for the foreseeable future? I think it looks like that is likely. Maybe not, but that is a huge question, and that will have huge consequences, both economically, politically, and militarily. So I would just say that we're sort of moving around in the dark here. It's very hard to see exactly where we're headed. But you can tell all sorts of stories, as I've just tried to do, that tell you that the future could be quite bleak in the greater Middle East.
And you know what is clear, Dr. Mearsheimer, what you've also said previously is that the real winners of this conflict are Russia and China.
Absolutely, the Russians for sure. You want to remember that as a result of the crisis in the world economy, it's very important to get as much oil as possible out into the global market. So we have this amazing situation where the United States is allowing Iran to ship its oil through the Strait of Hormuz out into the global market. We have this amazing situation where the United States has taken economic sanctions off of Iranian oil because we want to see Iranian oil flow into the world market. But of course, this is making Iran richer. To go to the case of Russia, we've taken sanctions off Russian oil as well. So this is a big victory for Russia. Sanctions on Russian oil have been taken off. Why? Because again, we need Russian oil in the world market. Furthermore, the flow of weapons to Ukraine, where Russia is fighting the Ukrainians, is going to slow down greatly. Why? Because the United States needs to send weapons to the Middle East. It needs to send weapons to support Israel, which of course will be done at the expense of Ukraine, which is to Russia's advantage. So you see, from Russia's point of view, this is what I like to call manna from heaven. And then if you go to China, as you know, since about 2017, the United States has adopted a containment policy toward China. We pivoted to Asia, and we were pivoting to Asia, East Asia, in large part to contain China. Well, what's happening today? We're pivoting away from Asia because we're taking critically important military forces that are located in places like South Korea and Japan, and we're moving them to the Middle East. This is not going to help contain China. In fact, it's completely counterproductive. And furthermore, it's going to do harm to our relations with both the South Koreans and the Japanese, who are going to say to themselves, can we really depend on the United States in the face of this China threat, given the fact that they're pivoting away from us at a critical moment? So that's a big victory for China. And my final point would be that, as I said before, China's influence in the greater Middle East is only going to grow with time, because China is going to look like it's a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And the United States has proved over the past few years that it cannot be counted on to behave in a responsible and in a smart way.
So finally, Dr. Mearsheimer, after listening to your analysis, the conclusion that I'm drawing is that the world is going to look very different once that conflict ends, and some of the things that we can fairly confidently say is that we will be seeing a weakened and wounded United States, in many ways a weaker, more damaged Israel, a more powerful Russia and China. The Gulf countries will, of course, it'll take a lot of time for them to get back to where they were before the war. In all of this situation and the kind of landscape that we are looking at, I'd like to bring you back to our part of the region. You've also followed India and Pakistan very closely, and you've also written the tragedy of great power politics and the fact that we are two nuclear nations, and we had a conflict last year in which Pakistan did very well, and we believe, and the world also believes, that we were able to humble India in many ways, and since then the stock of Pakistan has risen. We are today, Dr. Mearsheimer, in a very unique position where, of course, we have a very strong alliance with China, historical. We have very good ties with Russia, the two victors that you have mentioned, who will end up looking much better after the conflict. We have good relations with Donald Trump, and of course we have a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. And in the diplomatic field, we've far surpassed India, at least in this conflict where we are playing a central role, and India is nowhere to be seen. So based on all this and the post-conflict situation, do you think that a country like Pakistan, emerging as a strong middle power in the region, in South Asia, West Asia, Middle East, can play a far bigger role than it has been in the previous years?
I think the big issue for Pakistan moving forward is its relationship with India, and the fact that Pakistan is very close to China. And from India's point of view, China is a significant threat. And that means that the United States, over time, once this fiasco in the Middle East is over with, the United States will have a vested interest in moving closer to India. again, mainly because of the Chinese threat. And at the same time, as you pointed out, and as we all know, Pakistan has very close relations with China. So if you think about the US China competition as the central feature of international politics moving forward, and I think that is correct, by the way, you have this very interesting situation where China is pulled towards, Pakistan is pulled towards China and India is pulled towards the United States. And I think that will have significant consequences for Pakistan and make it difficult moving forward to execute a smart foreign policy.
Dr. John Mearsheimer, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us today.